Upon the creation of the German Empire in 1871, the various states that were incorporated into the empire brought with them their history, culture, armies, industry, and critically to us, navies. Before the creation of the empire, the various northern German states, notably Prussia, had been building more modern warships, like central battery ironclads and gunboats. The new empire, under Prussian leadership, had to protect its trade and coastline. Still, the Prussians had never been known as a seafaring nation. Through the coming years of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they would become a premier naval power, creating powerful battleships and, important to us, battlecruisers, or more apt for the Kaiserliche Marine, Panzerkreuzer or Großenkreuzer, depending on the time of development. In today's video, we'll cover the development of Germany's battlecruisers, in terms of completed ships that is. The first ship we have up on today's list is the large armored cruiser, Blücher, Germany's first attempt at a battlecruiser, where it's appropriate to open up with a quote from German battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations by Gary Staff. The term Panzerkreuzer means armored cruiser. The term battlecruiser was not used in Germany until after World War I. In Germany, the battlecruiser type was referred in official documents as Großenkreuzer, or large cruisers. Still, the men of the Imperial Navy referred to them as Panzerkreuzer, and that's how Rear Admiral/Vice Admiral Hipper referred to his ships of the 1st Scouting Group or Reconnaissance Group in his official reports. As with all other navies that developed the battlecruiser type during this period, the roots of the German battlecruiser lay in the old armored cruiser type. In contrast to the battleship type, the development of the armored cruiser type was less well defined. The large protected cruisers of the past were rather interesting, such as the Royal Navy's Challenger class, being not so well protected, focusing on range, high speed, a certain amount of combat power, and armor over vital bits like the machinery spaces. Early in the start of the 20th century, the French and British began building armored cruisers, having those characteristics mentioned previously, with additions of better protection. There were exceptions to this, of course. The smaller navies such as Germany, Japan, Italy, and Austria had to make great use of combat strength, as they could not produce cruisers in comparable numbers to the Royal Navy. The armored cruiser, therefore, had the genesis in a smaller, weaker armored ship as competition between speed and armor began. However, there was a pursuit for battleship-like qualities, which had as its basis the battle between artillery and armor. Just as battleships began to mount larger secondary batteries, armored cruisers also got larger guns, with ships like the Warrior class having 9.2-inch guns and 7.2-inch guns. I think an interesting point in the development for Blücher comes in January 1904, when Kaiser Wilhelm II wrote in a naval magazine under the pseudonym L about the modern armored cruiser, and shows where the emperor's mind was at the time when it came to armored cruisers. The monarch's naval interests were not confined to doodling ship designs on the back of telegrams. The main critique of his article was that of the displacement of the cruisers was approaching that of battleships, and if this path continued, it would be to the detriment of the battleship type. The Kaiser warned the armored cruiser was only a necessary accessory. He wrote that armored cruisers were becoming so large and expensive that soon, in France for example, the cost would exceed that of battleships, and therefore, why not simply build battleships? The Kaiser was an advocate for the fast battleship concept, a fusing of two warship types. However, his concept of a real battlecruiser was that it would not exceed the cost of a battleship. It would have a speed of 3 or 4 knots over contemporary battleships, have sufficient coal supply that after completing its primary reconnaissance role could join the battle line. Therefore, the cruiser's armament should consist of a 24cm or 21cm gun, together with a 15cm gun as a secondary battery, and armor to protect the ship's vitals from the same. Nevertheless, a fast battleship embodying these characteristics, but with heavy artillery, would probably exceed 30,000 tons, and be rejected in a memorandum by Admiral von Tirpitz, the State Secretary of the Reichsmarine Amt, RMA or Imperial Office, on technical and financial grounds. Prior to the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese had designed a new type of armored cruiser with 4 12-inch guns and protected by 7 inches of armor. The first two ships were Tsukuba and Ikoma, followed by Ibuki and Karuma, and despite the relatively low speed of 20.5 to 23 knots, they were really the first battlecruisers in a modern sense, and were re-rated when the British introduced the world to the term with the Invincible class, and with the Japanese being able to use the armored cruiser in the line of battle, confirmed the Japanese design philosophy correct, and got the State Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, more interested in the ship type. And with the fleet law having passed in 1900 that gave provision to such vessels, the Germans began to build them, and the first German armored cruisers followed the British model. But there were further discussions as to which direction the further development should take. The fast battleship concept was rejected because of doubts about the technical feasibility and the expected cost. However, the need for a Glossenkreuz type was seen as real. There was also discussion about the nomenclature of the type. The term Glossenkreuz was used in preference to Panzerkreuz, and this is how the type was described in the fleet laws. Nevertheless, in Britain, the role of the armored cruiser was changing and moving away from trade protection. The British ships of the Duke of Edinburgh class, Warrior, and Minotaur classes were intended to act in cooperation with the fleet and squadron strength as a fast wing. The task for the German armored cruisers were seen by von Tirpitz to be reconnaissance, defeating the enemy's reconnaissance cruisers, protecting their own lighter forces, and pursuing damaged enemy ships. The Kaiser also wanted them to have the capability of fighting in the line of battle, to have line capability. State Secretary von Tirpitz was against the line capability. However, German armored cruisers at the time suffered from the handicap that their lengths were limited by the size of the Wilhelmshaven locks, and therefore their maximum speeds were in the order of 21 to 21.5 knots. Compared to this, the British armored cruisers had speeds of up to 23 knots. The large 3 entrance at Wilhelmshaven only opened in 1910. At a meeting in May 1904, the General Navy Department demanded the next large cruiser ships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, should be able to enter the line of battle in place of a damaged battleship, desiring an increase in armament to 8 21-centimeter guns. Tirpitz countered by saying it would cost an extraordinary amount to do so, but the next cruiser, Cruiser E, the future Blücher, could be modified somewhat, having a slightly larger budget for 1906. Over the coming months and years, the German naval departments debated about the size, gun power, and armor of Cruiser E, where again taking from staff. Just 9 days after the meeting for final decisions about Cruiser E, on May 31, 1906, the naval attaché in London reported that the new British battlecruiser Invincible would mount a main battery of 12-inch guns. This news came at the worst conceivable moment for the Imperial Navy. The jump to the all-big gun battleship had meant an enormous cost increase, and State Secretary von Tirpitz was still endeavoring to incorporate the cost increase into the estimates. Now, it appeared likely that this process would be repeated for the cruisers. Only a few days previously, on May 26, the Reichstag had approved the naval estimates for 1906, and this only contained the means for a 15,500-ton cruiser. The Cruiser E had reached the limit of its budget. Then, on July 12th, the attaché confirmed the news. The RMA was forced to consider the future of Cruiser E. An increase in gun caliber to 24 centimeters had already been studied in designs E-17 to E-23, and was outside the budget for E. Likewise, the armor would have to be improved to resist 12-inch shells. The only alternative appeared to be constructing Cruiser E as it had been designed, of which Blücher was a development on the Scharnhorst class, the armored cruiser class of course, not the battleship class later on. Taking from Aden Dodson and the Kaiser's battle fleet, German capital ships 1871 to 1918, the 1906 large cruiser E, the first of the additional vessels provided for under that year's fleet law amendment, was also delayed by a labyrinthine design process. The first pair of designs A and B, later E1 and E2 of March 1905, were developed. The first with the prototype's 8 21-centimeter guns, the other with 12 21-centimeter guns and 6 twin turrets. Both had improved protection, the belt being 20% thicker. The increased power required a 5th boiler room, giving the E1 a corresponding number of funnels, although later designs used trunking to revert to 4. The significantly increased cost of E2's 4 extra 21cm guns led to E3, with the beam guns reduced to 3 a side and placed back in casemates. Further options studied included E5, with main battery numbers cut back to 8, with single turrets on the beam but more secondary guns. May 1905 Scheme E6 replaced E5's 10-15cm secondary weapons with 8 17cm guns, on an extra 500 tons, paralleling the contemporary growth in the size of the new battleships. E7 representing a further, slightly smaller variation on the theme, and E8 reverting to a 15cm secondary battery, but keeping the number of those guns at 8 to allow for an extra pair of 21cm weapons. There was some thought in using 24cm weapons, or 9-inch guns, on these cruisers, arranged in E2 and E5. Still, they were too big and expensive, with further developments about the machinery and armor, with the arrangement of the weaponry similar to her battleship counterparts in the Nassau class. Blücher ended up with machinery for 25.4 knots top speed, an armament of 12 21cm guns, 8 15cm guns, 16 8.8cm guns, and 4 4.5cm guns, with some rather hefty armor to go along with it, where I think Dodson summarizes the differences between her and her British counterparts. By the time the large cruiser E/Blücher was laid down in February 1907, all 3 of the new British Invincible-class armored cruisers, soon to be dubbed battlecruisers, were approaching launch, and with their 12-inch, 305mm guns, outclassed the German ships. This disparity had been revealed a week later after the design for the large cruiser had been finally approved in May 1906, by which time it was too late and unaffordable, the funding for the 1906 program having been approved by the Reichstag on May 26th, to change the ship in any meaningful way. An oft-told story that the armament of the Blücher was the result of a planned false document giving the Invincibles a 9.2-inch, 234mm armament finds no support in contemporary German design documents, and also does not work with the chronology of the respective ships' design processes. Although her main battery did not match the British ships, Blücher's protection was superior to theirs, belt 80 to 180mm versus Invincible's 100 to 152mm. And although powered by reciprocating engines, she was only a knot slower and overall a far better balanced design. Given the fact that Blücher's guns were of a similar range to those of Invincible, she could have given a good account of herself against an early British battlecruiser, especially given the latter's light protection. She certainly would have been able to deal decisively with the last of the conventional big cruisers, the British Minotaurs, American Tennessee, and French Waldeck-Rousseaus, all of which were slower and had much poorer protection. Armament-wise, the French vessel had an all-big gun battery of 14 194mm, 9 available on the broadside. The British had a mixed one of 4 9.2-inch, 234mm, and 10 7.5-inch, 191mm, broadside of 4 9.2-inch plus 5 7.5-inch, and the Americans 4 10-inch, 254mm, plus a 6-inch, 152mm secondary battery. Given the development of the Invincibles, notably their armament, there is no question about the next large cruiser for 1907 would have to have a jump in armament. This armament ended up being 8 28cm guns on the large cruiser Von der Tann. Blücher was commissioned in October of 1909 and served with the scouting groups before and during the First World War, where the large armored cruiser met her end during the January 1915 Battle of Dogger Bank at the hands of British battlecruisers, being inadequate to face off against such large caliber guns, as well as the British speed advantage over the ship. The efforts for a battlecruiser for the high seas fleet can be roughly traced back to where our story starts with Von der Tann, where the Kaiserliche Marine had been developing a response to rumors of British ships, and to quote from Gary Staff's wonderful German battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations. Just 9 days after the meeting for the final decision about Cruiser E on May 31st, 1906, the naval attaché in London reported that the new British battlecruiser Invincible would mount a main armament of 12-inch guns. This news came at the worst conceivable moment for the Imperial Navy. The jump to the all-big gun battleship had meant an enormous cost increase, and State Secretary von Tirpitz was still endeavoring to incorporate this cost increase into the estimates. The only alternative appeared to be constructing Cruiser E as it had been designed. In any case, the building materials and armament had already been ordered and assembled. On February 21st, 1907, the keel of E, the Leda Blücher, was laid in the Imperial dockyard at Kiel. The next Große F would have to be designed and built in response to the newly evolved British battlecruisers. So, to sum that up, the Germans had been building the large armored cruiser Blücher in response to what they thought the British were developing, and once it became clear that the British had different plans for their battlecruisers, it was too late. The Germans would have to go back to the drawing board to create a new large cruiser. Again, taking from staff, on May 17, 1906, 2 weeks before the first report from the London Naval Attaché about the British Invincible, the Kaiser launched a competition between the German shipyards for a fast battleship type. This new type crystallized the Kaiser's ideas regarding the new direction in warship construction, that these ships should form a division for special purposes and also serve as reconnaissance cruisers. Therefore, compared to foreign contemporary battleships, they should have a speed advantage of 3 knots and should mount at least 4 28cm guns so they could fight in the line. The new battleships of the Ersatz-Bayern/Nassau class should form the basis of the new type. The State Secretary of the Navy Department, Admiral von Tirpitz, was against the idea of the competition, as it would strain the already overworked staff of the Imperial Dockyards and the Naval General Staff. Further discussions and memorandums between the different sections of the General Navy Department regarding the developments concerning the new British Invincible class and other possible threats made them come to some conclusions. The General Navy Department considered that we must build our Großenkreuz as fast battleships. The General Navy Department foresaw that for years the large cruiser of the Imperial Navy had no possibility of strategic reconnaissance and escort on a large scale, or independent cruiser warfare and merchant protection, and this would conflict with the operational objectives of the ships. The principal purpose for the ships, for now, was purely participation in decisive battles as a fast wing. This task required the displacement of a contemporary battleship and an armament that must be effective against battleships, as a confrontation between these two types was inevitable. The General Navy Department was convinced about this. Therefore, there is a fundamental disagreement between the General Navy Department and the State Secretary on the question of operational employment. Admiral von Tirpitz saw the opponents of the large cruiser only as other cruisers. The General Navy Department had also shown remarkable insight, which proved correct in every way. As the summer carried on and discussions about the new type of ship continued either publicly or behind closed doors, shortly after September 4th, 1906, the State Secretary sent a request to the various departments and laid out his thoughts for the Großenkreuz. I request that the accelerated working through of this project for our Großenkreuz to the following criteria. A. Heavy artillery, 8 28cm, 4 in double, 4 in single turrets. B. Medium artillery, 8 to 10 15cm. C. Light artillery, as in the Großenkreuz E. D. The displacement should not exceed that of the battleship Ersatz Bayern. E. The price should be below that of the Ersatz Bayern. F. Speed is approximately as that of Großenkreuz E. G. Compared to Großenkreuz E, the armor should be strengthened with all means. H. If possible, turbines. The State Secretary had committed to the conceptual proposal from earlier in the summer, and with that, its inevitable consequences, such as a greater cost and defensive qualities, as the new Panzerkreuzer would have to resist 12-inch gunfire. Development of Von der Tann's eventual design developed rapidly through the summer of 1906, where again, taking from staff, so far, the development of the first German battlecruiser, the large cruiser F, had occurred in a remarkably short space of time. Not even a month had passed since the State Secretary had first instructed the construction department to implement a design utilizing 28cm guns, and the latest design variants had been created within a week. However, further changes and iterations developed over the coming year. Although I would love to delve in more into the development of Von der Tann and the other early battlecruisers, we just don't have time for that in this video, as there's so much to cover. Suffice it to say, the final design of Von der Tann was ready by late September 1907, when the construction of the large cruiser started in Hamburg. The ship displaced 19,370 tons standard displacement and 21,300 tons full load. She was powered by 18 coal-fired boilers that provided steam for 4 turbines that drove 4 screws, producing around 42,000 shaft horsepower as designed, with a maximum of 79,802 shaft horsepower. The ship was designed to have a top speed of 24.8 knots, but in actuality, it was more like 27.4 knots. The main armament of Von der Tann was 8 283mm 45 caliber or 11-inch guns and twin turrets, with 1 forward, 1 aft, and with 2 turrets on either side of the ship in echelon. The ship carried 10 150mm or 5.9-inch 45 caliber guns and casemates, 5 per side. She would also carry 16 88mm or 3.3-inch 45 caliber guns. To round out the armament, she had 4 underwater torpedo tubes. Her armor layout did vary, but her belt had a thickness ranging from 80 to 250mm or 3.1 to 9.8 inches. The armored decks varied from 50 to 80mm or 2 to 3 inches. The turrets had a face thickness of 230mm or 9 inches, and the sides and back had 180mm or 7 inches of armor. She was laid down in March of 1908, launched in March of 1909, and commissioned into the Kaiserliche Marine in September 1910. Our story with Moltke begins in April of 1907, with the State Secretary of the Navy, Admiral von Tirpitz, who declared verbally that the large cruiser or battlecruiser of 1908 was going to be an enlarged version of the 1907 design, which was SMS Von der Tann. The construction department of the Imperial German Navy responded to this declaration by saying that the budget could only fund a ship armed with 8 305mm or 12-inch guns, as the battleships of that year were supposed to carry 305mm guns. Still, the State Secretary and others thought that 11-inch or 283mm guns of the previous class were sufficient to handle other foreign capital ships. This was thought partially because it was felt that battle would be undertaken against an enemy with a superior numerical advantage, i.e. the Royal Navy. So it was important to increase the number of barrels to be able to engage more than one enemy at a time. The construction department suggested the number of guns should be increased to 12 as opposed to 8 found on Von der Tann, and the maximum speed of the new battlecruiser should not be below 24.5 knots. Almost a comical amount of arguments and discussions back and forth from the various departments ensued, and the General Navy Department said the introduction of the 305mm gun was necessary for the battlecruisers because it was the opinion of the General Navy Department that the primary task of the battlecruisers would be involved in the line of battle. Going on to describe how the General Navy Department understood that the construction department's view and listed possible solutions. The General Navy Department requested an investigation for the study of an arrangement of 10 305mm guns in dreadnought-style positioning, and how the secondary battery should be arranged. With all of that being said, on the 17th of May 1907, the Imperial Office had a meeting that would set out the basic fundamentals for the cruiser of 1908. It was to have an approximate displacement of 22,000 tons, a main armament of 10 283mm guns, along with 10 150mm guns, along with a propulsion system that should provide for a speed of 24 to 24.5 knots. The design, designated G2I, was approved by the Kaiser on May 28, 1907, although there were different design ideas and other variations of the design. G2I represented the final form Moltke with a minimal amount of changes. More detailed design work took quite a bit of time due to a personnel shortage. The most notable difference between Moltke and Von der Tann was the addition of another 283mm twin turret, which would be positioned aft in a super-firing position. This would give the greatest training arc with the smallest increase in weight. There were other changes as compared to Von der Tann, like an increase in displacement by 3,600 tons, with some of that going to increased armor. After some political hiccups related to the new ship, sketches based on the G2I design were approved by the Kaiser on March 26, 1908. There were adjustments to the armor scheme, secondary battery, displacement, and boiler rooms. Some further design finagling would follow, but eventually the design was ready, and the keel was laid down in early December 1908. Moltke displaced 22,979 tons as designed, and had a full load displacement of 25,400 tons. 24 boilers powered 2 sets of Parsons turbines, which drove 4 shafts, producing 52,000 shaft horsepower as designed, and had a maximum of 85,782 shaft horsepower, giving the ship a design top speed of 25.5 knots, and a true maximum of 28.4 knots. The main battery consisted of 10 283mm or 11-inch 50 caliber guns in twin turrets, with 1 forward and 2 aft in super firing positions, along with 2 turrets in wing positions. The secondary battery would be 12 150mm or 5.9-inch 45 caliber guns. Moltke also carried 12 88mm 45 caliber guns, along with 4 torpedo tubes, with 1 forward, 1 on each side, and 1 aft. Now, as for the armor scheme, I'll be referring to an image found in German battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations by Gary Staff, which will appear on screen right now. This image does a lot more justice than I would ever describing Moltke's armor scheme. I will note Moltke's armor scheme was different than that of Von der Tann. I'll leave this on screen for a bit so you can examine it. He also writes about the armor scheme. The armor of Cruiser G was improved about its predecessor Von der Tann in that it was thicker. The armor deck stretched from stern post to the stem and was horizontal in the middle part. Moltke was laid down in December 1908, launched in April 1910, and commissioned into the High Seas Fleet in September 1911. When it comes to Goeben, there really isn't a lot to be said about the design and development, as she was essentially a copy of Moltke, with very minor differences. So we'll move on to Seydlitz. The first mention of the large cruiser of 1910 would be in March 1909, when Korvettenkapitein Volothun of the General Navy Department was given the responsibility to put characteristics of the type development down on paper and to discuss the development of the dreadnought, which Germany had taken as compared to other nations of the world. In German battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations by Gary Staff, in which a piece of the memorandum Volothun had written to the State Secretary is found in the book, to which he says, "In the tight development of our Großenkreuzer since '07, inspired by the English Invincible class, we have increasingly pursued the qualities of a fast battleship to make the authorized number of large ships, as far as possible, also capable of fighting in the line. This approach with our Großenkreuzer since '07 has given them a different character to the English, and has brought their displacement to that of the battleships." This is an important statement that sums up the differences between the design philosophy of the Royal Navy and the Kaiserliche Marine, with the Royal Navy emphasizing heavy artillery and high speeds at the cost of armor. Volothun went on to describe how he believed that these ships, even at long ranges, are at a severe disadvantage against the ships armed with heavy artillery. This encapsulates the difference between the two design philosophies, writing, "The English battleship cruisers stand against our cruiser battleships." Volothun recommends that German battlecruiser development should closely follow that of the battleship development regarding combat power and displacement. Speed, however, the defining characteristic of these battlecruisers, should be bought with only a small sacrifice in combat strength or an increase in displacement even above that of battleship displacement. Volothun felt that a large cruiser, possibly the same size as a contemporary battleship, the same age, should also have an excess of 3.5 to 4 knots speed advantage. Through progressive memorandums in March and April, different ideas about the turret layouts, including possibly using triple 30.5cm turrets, as well as the budget for ships in 1910. The discussion about armament and budget went into September. Tirpitz wanted preliminary designs to be available to him to present to the Kaiser by September 27, 1909, with the basic criteria being 10 28cm 50 caliber guns and twin turrets. Tirpitz received a memorandum discussing the high-sided armor deck that exposed the vital parts of the ship, and it seemed an increase in speed was necessary as new intelligence had been gathered regarding British battlecruiser development. Tirpitz had to reiterate that there was no price increase for the large cruiser. Any further decisions about the large cruiser of 1910 would be postponed until his return from the Kaiser's hunting lodge. He addressed two things, whether a third sister to Moltke, which expected to offer a shorter building time, as well as any changes to Design 2, one of the preliminary designs to improve it, came within the cost framework. On October 8th, Tirpitz received a modified Design 2B of 24,000 tons with the lower part of the hull partitioned into 3 boiler rooms, in which he agreed to this, and ordered further improvements to 2C, which had a displacement of 24,700 tons, with 300 millimeters of armor for the engine rooms, and a speed that matched Moltke, deciding against a repeat of the Moltke type. While Design 2C continued to be worked on, another design would sneak in, 4E. Through further discussion, the two designs' pros and cons were evaluated on the 21st of December 1909, with a meeting convened concerning the design of the 1910 large cruiser. Due to the need for an immediate decision, the design chosen was 2C. However, in January, a further change to Design 2C came about, being titled 2E, which followed a similar line to Moltke and Goeben, but with a raised forecastle. The armor deck could not be lowered because of the engines and boilers, but the thickness was increased. The belt armor up to 1.4 meters above the construction waterline increased to 300 millimeters, and then tapered to 230 millimeters, with the turret armor being increased as well. The armament was the same as Moltke, but the fire height of the bow turret was increased by 1.6 meters. With the displacement increase, machinery output was increased to 52,000 shaft horsepower, and therefore a slightly higher speed than Moltke, with the number of boilers being increased to 27. Seydlitz was laid down in February of 1911, launched in March of 1912, and completed in April of 1913, and commissioned in May of 1913. As for the ship's particulars, the large ship displaced 24,988 tons as designed, but a full load displacement of 28,550 tons. The machinery consisted of 27 small water tube boilers with 2 high-pressure turbines and 2 sets of low-pressure turbines, giving the ship a design shaft horsepower of 63,000 and an actual maximum of 89,738, giving it a design top speed of 26.5 knots and a true maximum of 28.1 knots. As for the armament, the ship carried 10 28cm 50 caliber guns in twin turrets, 1 forward, 2 aft, and 1 on either side of the ship. The medium caliber armament consisted of 12 15cm 45 caliber guns and armored casemates, while the light artillery consisted of 12 8.8cm 45 caliber guns mounted in various positions around the ship, while having wartime additions of anti-aircraft batteries installed on the ship as well. The torpedo armament consisted of 4 underwater torpedo tubes, with a bow tube, 2 broadside tubes, and 1 stern tube offset to port. The armor of Seydlitz was improved in comparison to that of her predecessors, Moltke and Goeben, being improved through thickness. Much like previously with Moltke, I will show you the original diagram for the armor scheme of Seydlitz provided by Gary Staff's German battlecruisers of World War I. I'll give you some highlights though. The armored belt varied in thickness from 100mm to 300mm. The deck also varied between 30mm and 80mm. The forward part of the conning tower had a thickness of 300mm. The main battery turrets had a face thickness of 250mm, sides of 200mm, and rears of 210mm. This is a good point to split the video off into 2 separate videos. I was originally going to make this one video, and I might still in some sort of supercut edition, but for now it's getting rather unwieldy. We'll go into Der Flinge and the other battlecruisers from there on. Thanks for watching everyone, please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time my friends, have a great week.